So I scripted this one because I think this is a pretty touchy topic at the moment, but we're going to be talking about PDA. When it comes to PDA or any topic involving mental health, statistics, etc., we need to do some research before we start spouting all information. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details about PDA because I'm definitely not an expert about it. I'm also still learning what this term means and the history of it in association to ODD, but I've recently been seeing this topic come up on my FYP, especially from autistic individuals talking about their experiences as a PDA autistic. Now, I'm in no way trying to invalidate autistic people who identify or say they have PDA, but I do want to bring up some concerns we may want to think about based on a study I have discussed with my friend Kelly. In 1994, the field of autism diagnosis saw a huge change with inclusion of Asperger's syndrome in the DSM-4. It distinguished itself by the absence of developmental delays and intellectual disability in contrast to other autism spectrum disorders of the time. However, the narrative took a turn in 2012 when a study shed light on the heterogeneous application of these diagnoses. Regional differences surfaced, influencing the types of services autistic people received based on different diagnoses. This non-uniformity resulted in a disparate support system for individuals sharing the same medical condition. Recognizing the far-reaching consequences of this heterogeneity, the DSM-5 underwent a massive reconfiguration in 2013. The decision to fold the three autism spectrum diagnoses into a singular category reflected an acknowledgement of the inherent diversity within the spectrum. Parallel to this development, in 2003, Elizabeth Newson introduced a novel, pervasive developmental disorder term called pathological demand avoidance, or PDA. Despite lacking empirical validation, PDA became associated with autism, emerging as a distinctive profile within the community. On TikTok, under the hashtag pathological demand avoidance, the majority of creators identified are predominantly white, lower support needs, and articulate autistic individuals. This observation raises pertinent questions regarding the potential consequences of subtyping. In considering the history of autism subtypes, a careful approach is imperative. The historical precedent of subtyping influencing access to services and funding necessitates careful consideration. In a contemporary context where the clinical heterogeneity of the autism spectrum is widely acknowledged within the scientific community, the autistic community alike, an evidence-based and nuanced perspective is crucial to safeguard the well-being of all autistic individuals. I highly encourage us to take the time to read about PDA. Luckily, Callie has provided a free library with these resources, and I've included a link to the PDA folder in the comments. I suggest starting with this article, PDA demand avoidance symptoms but not a syndrome. Here's a list of articles in the folder to look into as well. Main things I'd like to bring up as you do your research is to think about 1, the racial history that isn't talked about enough when it comes to diagnosing ODD versus PDA with Black boys and men. Number 2, PDA is not a label that is currently diagnosable, since there's a lot of complexity aligned to the symptoms and it is not currently in the DSM-5. Number 3, examples that are going around in social media about PDA traits are heavily associated to autistic traits from the B2 autism category. Number 4, trauma and stress-induced experiences may have more attributing factors to our PDA reactions than what people label as PDA. So please take the time to read through the research and be mindful of the content you see on here, especially by those who say they have a PhD or are experts in PDA. I want us to really critically think about what a PhD label presents to a viewer when it is associated with topics like autism, PDA, etc. It makes it appear like that person is an expert in whatever field they're talking about and what they promote on their platform. However, if you actually research what that person's PhD is on their LinkedIn, you will see it either doesn't relate to autism at all, or it's a very specific to a niche about mental health, but again, not PDA or autism. Having a PhD does not mean that a person is an expert in the field either. People who get PhDs have to focus on a specific niche part of the field. So for example, if I were to get a PhD in neurodiversity, that doesn't mean I know everything about neurodiversity. My thesis, my research, my experience would have to be narrowed in on something extremely specific to neurodiversity, such as intersectionalities of neurodiversity, and even more specific in that subtopic. There's literally no way for somebody with a PhD to be an expert on any broad topic. Typical PhD programs take at least 4 to 6 years of research. You can be extremely knowledgeable in that field, but that doesn't mean you're a complete end-all be-all expert in that field. Also, I can't change how people view PDA, but I encourage our community to try not to rename it as pervasive demand for autonomy. Personally, when we remove the pathological from the equation, lack of control that is associated with that word, it can actually discount the severity of anxiety-induced reactions and makes PDA into a more conscious decision rather than a trauma-based response. This is another thing that's somewhat on the lines of a lot of other issues in our community. The reclassification of language for our disorder, like we have differences versus having a disability. So just remember that having these disorders and traits aren't inherently bad. If we minimize those issues, it can actually counteract our ability and the resources we all need in order to help us. Yes, we want to have neurodivergent affirming services and mindsets, but we are disabled. And we can't cover up the challenges we face by naming it something that is more pleasing. Talking about PDA as if it is an identifiable and diagnosable label can be harmful information and actually be a disservice to yourself if you think you have PDA. In my opinion, many autistic people, especially low support and late diagnosed, experience high levels of trauma and stress, and that trauma and stress are higher contributors to our reactions to inconsistencies rather than the need to have control. The need to have control stems from potentially traumatic and stressful experiences where we didn't have control, and that led to misunderstandings, meltdowns, etc. PDA can also be a lot more than just not wanting to do the dishes kind of thing, and examples that I've done a video on because I didn't know any better, and can show up in extreme severities for some autistic people. In general, let's try to educate ourselves first before we go out onto this platform trying to educate others. And if we do want to share information, please bring resources to the table. Otherwise, it'll really sound like you're pulling all these facts from solely personal experiences personal experiences. So that doesn't mean your experiences aren't valid, but experiences alone aren't enough to be deemed as facts.